had to be unpredictable. It's just got to be clever. The unpredictable is very strong, but you will have to do the experiments beforehand. But if it's a predictable area, and you have to submit things to ethics committees and you're finding problems, try doing the patent ethics committee experiment, publish. So this is my crib sheet. For patenting, a lot of things you publish academically do not have to have any commercial tie-in. You just want to show something interesting and something that contributes to your field. For patents, because even if the fees are relatively low in Vietnam for applying for a patent, they're still not zero. They may be less than some journals, but they might be more too. And especially if you're looking at internationally, they're going to be much more. So you want to think, is it valuable? It doesn't have to be valuable to anybody or everybody. It has to be valuable to at least one person. The more valuable it is, the more you want to patent. Then, this is kind of what I talked about. Can you describe how to make and use it, even if you don't have a prototype? Even if you haven't done the experiments? If you can't do this description, because this is required in your patent application, you have to do the experiments. So if you can't, you have to do more research. If you can, you need to check if it's new. You will know some of this from your academic research in the field, but you should also get in the habit of doing some patent research. And this can be done with free tools online, but it's a little bit tricky. But you can just try Google Patents is my first recommendation because it's an easy interface. If it's industrial applicable, then you should file a patent application. And you can do a petty patent if it's not obvious or if it's not inventive. So these are some special considerations of valuable thinking about drugs, vaccines, medical treatment. Will doctors use it? Some doctors get very used to a certain protocol or a certain treatment and they don't really want to try something new. If you can't explain why it works, they might be especially resistant. And if you can't show that it makes a statistically significant difference in patient outcomes, they're also going to be less likely to take it. Will insurance and public health systems pay for it? If it's treating a totally new disease, you will have to go through a lot more regulatory approval. And that's going to reduce the value, especially if it's a very early stage. You know, if it's just a drug target or drug lead. Is the recipe for production safe, scalable, and not prohibitively expensive? So, malaria treatments generally need to be relatively cheap. You're not going to be able to spend the same on malaria treatments as you are going to be on cancer treatments. I've heard some stories about these great new drugs, but there was an explosive stage in the molecule fabrication, or I'm not even sure what the appropriate name is. So the professor could do it in his lab because it was very small scale. But when they tried to sell it to a company, they're like, you realize this is explosive. We're not going to do this at an industrial scale because we don't want to buy the insurance for it and we don't want our plant to blow up. If any of the inputs are really rare or hard to source, you're going to drop your value a lot more. If it's an intravenous or an injectable medicine, you're not going to find a lot of patient uptake. A lot of people are scared of pills. It's hard to do intravenous drug distribution. You can't do it at home in almost all cases. You might have to have admissions, so that doubles or triples the cost. There's got to be a big upside for people to take that. Are the animal models you're using in your sort of early stage clinical or preclinical the same as the ones used by industry? If they're not, you need to be able to say why not. You might need, if yours are better, you might still need to use the industry models so that you can give them comparable data. Is it treating a medical need? If it's another X, why do we need another X? How many people would it help? And like we talked about with dengue, where are the people? If there are a bunch of people, but none of them are in Vietnam, you might not want a Vietnamese patent. If there's a bunch of people, but none of them are in the US, you're not going to want a US patent. When you're thinking about, and this is something some of you may never do, but I wanted to bring it up because I know Vietnam is pushing entrepreneurship and startups a lot. And I just read Saigon is going to have a big new Harvard Research and Medical Unit at the Saigon High-Tech Park starting next year. Okay, I read it in the newspaper.
Is that true? Is that true? Is Harvard going to set up here?
I heard of that. I don't think it's.
You do think?
Yeah, I heard of that, but I don't think it's a medical research. It's reviewed by the university economics.
Well, anyway,
I should be able to.
who knows what will help, but I've seen some news. So if there's any startups, either if you're interested in, if people come to you, what they will often be looking at is not just one thing. They will want something where they have kind of a pipeline of maybe you've got a class of molecules, and this is the best one, but you've patented the whole class. And some of these might also be good that they can keep testing. Or you've got one assay, but you also got some treatments or something like that. Are there similar products on the market, which, like we talked about before, helps with the regulatory approval and funding and marketing? And there's also for orphan drugs, I think for some diseases like the elephantitis, a lot of times these fall under international orphan drug programs, and they have some special funding mechanisms and public groups that are oriented towards promoting this type of drug development.
What is
Orphan drug is a drug for a disease that has a relatively small population and is not super closely related to other diseases, so it's been mostly neglected. So some of these genetic diseases that have a relatively small patient population but a huge effect on the patients.
Rare disease, rare disease.
Yeah. Okay. I knew somebody here would know that. But there are nonprofits that are trying to build and nurture startups in this area. They have some easier regulatory pathways in Europe and the US. I'm not sure what the situation is in Vietnam. And so it reduces some of the costs compared to like a cancer drug or a rheumatoid arthritis drug or something like that that kind of gets everybody.
Can I ask you one question?
Sure.
About orphan drugs. If it is not for benefit, if it is a small
people are human. Even though most people like to be rich, most people also like to do good. And a lot of these diseases have a horrible effect on the people who suffer from them. And wealthy people may have friends or relatives who are afflicted with these diseases, so they might contribute to a nonprofit. They might contribute their talents to building a startup for some of this. And governments have said, all of our population deserves health care. We don't have a solution for this disease yet, but we want research and we want to develop some kind of treatment if we can. So that's why, even if the population of it maybe is 100,000 in the world, there is limited funding and it's harder, but there are pathways. Some of what you do here from the European and US perspective, malaria is a rare disease. I went to high school in Papua New Guinea, so I've had malaria and I've taken malaria drugs. And when I went back to the US, the warning was never go to the hospital if you have malaria. You have to go to a university with a tropical medicine clinic. Otherwise, you are like a strange person. They will think you have the flu, they will think you have cancer, they will never think you have malaria. Here, it's the opposite. Malaria is pretty common, and people understand it and have an idea how to treat it and know some of the difficulties. So, I guess what I'm saying is that healthcare is almost a human good, even if it is only one person's life. As a researcher, you have the potential to help many people in many different ways. And even people who are in business or policy also like some of those opportunities. And that's why these sort of special paths for orphan drugs get funded and get made. It's a little bit trickier to find them as opposed to like something that is a high priority. Like, malaria is and dengue are high priorities in tropical countries. Cancer is a high priority everywhere. Heart disease, obesity, diabetes, those are high priorities everywhere. But some of these other diseases, you have to find the people who care, and it's a little bit harder, but people care. Does that make sense? So, this picture is from an actual patent application. This is somebody's invention about how they will solve the problems of hurricanes and tornadoes. They will send a plane up to fly over the center of the tornado or the hurricane and drop a super coolant in the middle, which will cool down the area of heat. I see your face, you're like, what? And that is exactly why this patent application was denied. Because this picture, basically, they wrote maybe 5 pages to try to explain it, but it didn't give step-by-steps. It was not convincing to actually make the invention work. So that's why I say, if you haven't done the experiments, you need to be able to explain it clearly enough to convince somebody who has a good idea of what's going on in your general field that your plan would work. And so that's why for the unpredictable things, or the unexplored things, like I don't know that anybody's flown a plane above a hurricane because they probably didn't want to die. You need to explain more and give more data and more details. And that's why the patents are valuable compared to academics with maybe the short method section. And this is a story from math, but I think many people may have heard of Fermat's last theorem. When I was in graduate school in physics, the textbooks would often say, and exercise left for the reader. And we knew whenever we read those exercises, those would be the problems nobody could solve. And Fermat's theorem was pretty much the same. It was just like a little note with some equation and, oh, this proof is so cool, basically. And people couldn't solve it for 50 years. So just because something is clear in your mind, you have to be able to explain it. So trade secrets in the patent idea are basically the information that is valuable because it's not publicly known. Before you file your patent, your idea, your information, your research results are valuable because you're not publishing them until you file the patent. Industry will also keep things secret, like KFC's secret recipe, Coke's secret recipe, things like that, because they know that nobody can reverse engineer them. If you're in academia, our mission is to share knowledge. And the benefit of publishing academically makes trade secrets unappealing. But you might want to know what they are if you ever work with industry, because if you work with a drug giant, they may require you to protect the secrecy of some information. And they will want to be able to know what procedures you have on hand to do that, like password protection, locks, policies, things like that. So these are a few ways that I've talked about most of them to use a patent. I mean, the easiest way to use it is just to put it on your CV and get any credit you get from your institution. You may be also to license it to an existing business, use it to find a new partner for research, start a company. You can actually sell it. You can use it to protect your own ability. A lot of times patent owners will patent many steps in a drug development plan or some type of product or standards. For example, I mean, one of the common examples is smartphones. They usually have about 200 or more patents involved for the screen, for the hardware, for the design. And so what the big companies do is they say, I will give you my patents if you give me yours. So if you have something to share back, you can basically get freedom to keep doing your research without payment, because it's more like a barter system. And you can also find investors if you do this right. So this is some things I've heard about IP in Vietnam. Most of this is from ASEAN-sponsored, what they call it is technology commercialization training centers. There was one last month in Korea. There will be one next year in Thailand, in Krabi. So the Vietnamese government is making funding available for startups. Most university professors tend not to want to patent. My understanding is that the ownership of the patents mainly goes to the university or to the state, and there may be very little credit given from your university for patenting. That is, again, what I heard. So your knowledge is more than mine. Does anybody here know what would happen if you patented something here?
Sure, because the employer and the government.
Yeah.
Maybe like that.
So the Saigon High-Tech Park is supposed to have this Harvard thing, and I think there's also a couple of biotech and healthcare-oriented sort of web healthcare startups there now. They're trying to grow it. There's IDG Venture Capital, which is a venture fund targeted towards both web-based but also healthcare-oriented startups. So in addition to your patents, you can also look at other people's patents. If you have a research collaborator that you work with a lot, you might want to check on Google Patents and just Google their name, if it's not John Smith or Kim Lee or something like that. Because you might find extra technical information that you don't find anywhere else. If you're trying to do new research, you might want to check what other people have done and use patent information. Another thing that's very useful for smaller countries like Thailand or Vietnam is because patenting in many countries is expensive, big companies will only patent in the areas where they think it's worth it for them. So some drugs get patented, say US, Europe, maybe 10 other countries, but they might not be patented in Vietnam. Legally, you have the right to copy them. You use everything that's in that patented document and produce the drug yourself. So that's kind of interesting. There's an interesting patent that I thought, it's a method to treat high blood pressure, and it's basically, it's a US-based patent. And it's basically doing hand exercises at a certain effort and speed. And they had like a little robotic controller that would tell you how much to do and how much resistance to use after you do kind of a test to see how strong you were. And that's not patented in Thailand. And I thought that would be, when I was teaching high school physics, I thought that would be a great like science fair project for a student. So there are things like that. You know, drugs are a lot more complicated, but you know, there's still things like that that you can look at. People patent treatment protocols also. So it might be drugs that are already on the market that you can combine in a certain way. And you can also look at these patents to start to think about how to make the highest impact statement. All right, any questions about patents? I'm going to move on to copyrights and trademarks. All right. So copyrights and trademarks are a little bit more forgiving because you don't actually have to file the application before you publish. It's a good idea if you do the application for certain reasons, but if you publish by international treaty, as soon as you write something down, if you use a basic amount of creativity, it's copyrighted. So this was an interesting topic that we were talking about because I think everybody here publishes. If you haven't published, you want to. And I've heard that a lot of times if you have a kind of a groundbreaking publication, people like to publish a Vietnamese version on the hospital website. So this is very interesting because when you publish in a journal, you sign the author agreement and you usually give the journal the copyright. And the copyright prohibits anybody from copying without permission. And in the agreement, the journal will usually give the author a right to copy for certain academic purposes. But making a translation is not copying, right? It's the same information, but it's not an exact copy of the same words. So what it's called in copyright language is a derivative work. It's derived from the English version. However, if you drafted your paper in Vietnamese and then translated it into English, the Vietnamese version is not a derivative work. The English version is a derivative work. So this is complicated to think about, and I did make a slide, but this is a copyrighted document. And you can have 100 derivative works. So it's a derivative work. as soon as you wrote down this translation, you automatically get a copyright in it. So the copyright in this is kind of like an umbrella that covers all of this. But the copyright in this is a littler umbrella. You can make more derivative works from this. So let's say you have a Vietnamese translation, and Vietnam has some like tribal languages in the north. Am I right? So let's say somebody translated from Vietnamese into a tribal language, or Vietnamese into Chinese. So then you've got first derivative, second derivative. Theoretically, these people would have to ask permission from these people, who would have to ask permission from these people. However, if you started with the Vietnamese version, and you're the author, so you write in Vietnamese, then you translate to English, you make an agreement with the UK or US-based journal, then this is not a derivative work. So this copyright doesn't go backwards. Does that make sense? I see the faces thinking like, that makes no sense. So unlike a patent, which prohibits anybody from doing the same thing, even if they invent it by themselves. So let's take your assay for dengue, and you invent it here. And I am a researcher in the US. I've never been to Vietnam, I've never heard your talk, but I'm working on dengue. And I'm trying the same thing. If you have a US patent, I can't do it without your permission. But if you have a US copyright, let's say instead of an assay, it's a treatment protocol where you say, use this, just a set of instructions written down. I'm only prohibited from copying you. If I never saw your instructions, I didn't copy them, I thought it up independently by myself. So the thing to understand that's very different about copyright and patent is patent is an actual monopoly. Nobody else can do your thing, even if they have no idea that you did it first. For copyright, you have to prove that the person copied. So they have to have seen what you did and copied it somehow. They might not have copied it literally. There's a famous case where the Beatles had a hit song, but there was another hit song in the 1940s. And the melody line, the words were different, but the melody was very similar. And the original singers didn't stay as famous as the Beatles. They were famous in the 1940s, but then, you know, they were one-hit wonders or something. They weren't making any more money. But then the Beatles came, and they made all this money off the sound that, you know, it's da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, but just different singers. The first singers were female, the second ones were male. But the melody was the same. Copyright covers the written down notes or the recorded sound and the creativity. So they took them to court and they proved even though the Beatles didn't copy on purpose, it would have been almost impossible for them to live in England in the 1940s and not hear this song. So the Beatles had to pay, but they had to prove, the original 1940s songwriters had to prove that the Beatles heard their song and remembered it. So that's why if you start with the Vietnamese, it's no problem. If you end with the Vietnamese, I would strongly recommend looking at the author requirements, and Katrina and I looked at them quickly, and it seems like none of the journals think about translations. They don't mention it, but they do allow authors to post publications on nonprofit websites after 6 months. So I think it would be a patient enhancement for maybe the hospital or the clinical research unit to put in at some of the major journals, just a request on the author website and say, our authors would like to post Vietnamese translations. Do we have this official permission? Also, we suggest that you might want to add this to your policy for others who may want to translate and distribute research findings in other languages. So that's kind of a deep but crazy dive into copyright. Does anybody have any questions or want to think about examples? I think we've gone pretty long. You can see that I kind of like IP, so I can talk about it for a long time. So this is about copyright. The thing is, it has to be original. And that's ties in with the copy. It doesn't have to be inventive, it doesn't have to be industrially applicable. It has to be written down, and it has to be not copied from somewhere else. You have to originate it. And often it's sound, movies, audiovisual, music, drama, art. But the written and software stuff are the things that you will mostly find. Either, sometimes it can cover databases, articles, treatment protocols, instruction manuals, web applications.
My understanding is that most copyrighted works don't need to be registered as such, that the copyright just automatically confers that it's created.
It's according to the Berne Convention, which Vietnam and almost all the world is a party to. As soon as you write it down, you have a copyright, and your copyright is recognized on the same basis as natives of every other country. So the rights in Vietnam and the rights in the US might be slightly different, but once you've got the copyright, if you want to enforce it in the US, you have the exact same rights in the US as an American who wrote their paper in the US. And similarly, an American who came to Vietnam would have the exact same rights as you do. The difference is when you register, you might want to do it so that people who are searching for the registration can find it. Or if you need to protect something because it's super extra valuable. For academics, almost never is that appropriate. But if you need to enforce it, so say you write a paper and somebody copies it. Actually, let's take your example of you wrote your ethics proposal. Your paper. Now let's say instead of taking the idea and then rewriting it in his own words, he actually just took the papers you submitted and photocopied them and maybe cut your name off. And I've heard of people actually doing this, not in academia, but in business. It's like people made a manual, and they didn't even cut the name off of the company that made the manual, but they just photocopied the manual and put it on their product. If you need to get that person to stop using the legal system, you will almost always be better off if you register. But you don't have to register before you publish. You just have to register before you enforce.
So you could find out that there was a violation, then
And it might be, if you have to enforce, you almost always want to be talking to a lawyer. But if you hear about it, the first thing I would do is see if there's an easy form. Like in the US copyright registration is, you can download a form and it's like, I don't know, $10, and you can do it pretty much online. But the enforcement, you really need a lawyer to help you with. So if I heard about somebody copying and I was upset about it, the first thing I would do is try to register in whatever country they were copying in. The second thing I would do is try to talk to a lawyer and see, is it reasonable? The interesting thing about copyright enforcement is because copyright is seen to protect your creativity, violating it isn't only economic. Like if you were selling books and somebody was copying your books and giving them away free or selling them at half price, it'd be easy to calculate, well, they're taking this much of my money. But if you're an academic researcher and somebody copies your academic paper and puts their name on it, you're not making much money off of your academic papers. It's your reputation that's hurt, right? And so most countries have fines and criminal penalties for copyright violation. So in the US and Thailand, there are set minimum level fines. For some things they're not super high, but they're high enough that like an individual person might not be happy to pay them. And there's also the possibility of going to jail. So in this kind of situation, when you're looking at enforcement, it's never going to be very happy. But if you're in a situation where you think, well, I can't sue them, I'm not going to get any money from them, you can think of it, you can get them to stop. And if what they're doing is hurting your reputation or bad for you, for what you're trying to do, for the mission of research or patients, the enforcement can be helpful. And a lot of countries, because copyright is such the international treaty, and the World Trade Organization and TRIPS also are involved in this, particularly with cross-border issues. A lot of countries are pretty happy to try to help people. If it is something physical, which for academic stuff it probably won't be, you can also get the customs people to try to stop things at the border and impound it. And that's usually helpful.
We've all seen those pictures of piles of DVDs getting bulldozed.
Yeah.
Small files.
So, that's, so what copyright, in addition to being able to enforce it, copyright is useful if you want to limit or control changes. So for example, like for treatment protocols or instructions for something that's complicated, you might want to be able to verify all the translations are high quality. I'm sure people have seen translations where they're hard to read, right? Because maybe the translator wasn't very skilled or was trying to go word for word, but the grammar was different in the two languages. So that's why, for example, if I was a publisher, they might have on purpose left the translations out because they might want to validate that the translation is high quality. It can also be useful for controlling distribution. You might want to have a copyright, but still make it free via open source or Creative Commons licensing, but do it over the internet so you can have a record of how many people are accessing this. That way you can get a measure for what kind of impact, you know, for example, let's say you have a treatment and it's all over-the-counter drugs, but you've got to have a specific mix of, say, Tylenol, cough medicine, I don't know, something else, acetylcysteine. I had a cold last week. And if you take these exactly at this time each day for 3 days, you'll have a good result. You might not want to charge any money for that, but it might be nice to have a record of how many people are using it. It could be regular people, it could be clinicians. And that might help you with your funding for nonprofit grants, things like that. You can use it to get money, and there are some distribution channels, mostly for music and movies, that if you have a copyright, you can kind of add in, and somebody else will manage it for you. For this type of work, it's almost not relevant, but the world is changing fast, and I think as telemedicine and the globalization of medical treatment goes on, these type of channels might start being developed. Okay, that's what I prepared. Anybody have any questions? Want to talk about anything? I didn't give my email on here, but if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Katrina has it. I actually do have cards, and there's only a few of you, so I can pass them out. Thank you guys for all your hard work. As somebody who's had malaria, I strongly support people trying to find cures for tropical diseases.
If there's no more questions for Eliza, any more questions? No?
Only 5 questions. Many companies have a copyright. Many companies, I think they keep a reference.
So that is called fair use. And if you take a small portion of a work, so if you have an article or a paper or a book, and you take a sentence or maybe even a paragraph, and you quote it to give a review, for commentary, for education, for research, for like, I don't know quite the best way to say this, like a teaser to get people interested in the whole thing. That's considered fair use. Because you're not copying the whole thing, you're copying a small part. So it's kind of like an introduction or a fair use. You're not taking all of it. And that's similar. Thailand has a very broad academic use. In Thailand, as long as you're in the university for teaching or research purposes, you can copy whole books.
But you must attribute use.
And that's two reasons. One is the thing about copyright. You need to show who the author is because they have a right not only to the commercial thing, but to be portrayed as the person who created whatever it is. But it's also an academic ethics thing. You don't want to portray somebody else's ideas as yours. That's considered pretty much the worst thing you can do because it's kind of lying and you're not creating more knowledge, you're just actually creating less.
Can I have one question about the translations? For example, as far as I know, that if we publish something in Vietnamese, then we prefer not to publish
So if you want to publish both.
Yeah.
So the legal issue is not very important here. An important issue is an academic publishing strategy issue. Most journals, for them, they want to publish things that are new to the academic world. So they will only accept articles that are new. And if you read their policies, they will be pretty strict about that. But from when I was in the research setting, I worked with a very smart mentor woman. And what she would do is she would call repackage the results. In the sense that she might do one set of experiments, and she was doing it in computational physics. So it would be basically a run of a simulation. And she would publish the first set from the simulation, or she would publish a description of how they set up the simulation. But then as she did more and more runs and was starting to get statistically significant results, she would publish again. Or she would publish as a talk focusing on one aspect and as something else focusing on another. So my recommendation would be when you give the Vietnamese language paper, think about what is most important for the Vietnamese audience and only include that much in the paper. And when you go for the international paper, maybe add another set of experimental results, maybe focus it a little bit more broadly, make it somehow so they're not exactly the same. You know, there may be some overlap, but the international journal might have a higher novelty standard, so you might want to publish there first, and the Vietnamese journal don't do a translation, but basically restate the same way in a slightly different format. If the Vietnamese journal doesn't have the same, what you publish here must be new. If they both journals say you must publish new, try to look at your research and talk about it so you have two different things that overlap slightly. So the scope of your research might be this big, but shine at one spotlight here, one spotlight here, one spotlight there. And I think from what I know, the researchers who are very successful do that. And that's how they get so many publications. They also work very hard and do a lot of work. But publication strategy, I think, is really important. Does that help?
That's good. I mean, because we are too junior, then
Yeah.
we cannot decide that, we cannot decide what should we do. Or we are afraid that if we publish in the nations, we shouldn't publish elsewhere, and we are quite afraid of violating copyright or anything else. And one more thing that I would like you to listen to your ideas about the, you know, in Vietnam, the science world is a bit separated from the clinical world. For example, medical doctor rarely, you know, rarely read the medical journal.
Right.
Yeah, so because of the language is
Yes.
a big barrier for them. So, for example, if I can see that most of the publication from Oakland we publish in English, and there is many informations on, for example, the drug resistance. Or some new things on microbiology, but local Vietnamese doctors are not updated due to just because of the barrier on the
English learning,
English and
probably time also.
yeah, and times and other habit
Yeah.
as well, the habit of not reading or